Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off was developed because there just wasn't a stretchy enough bind off, I think. I can't say that I know all of the details of it, but it does require, let's make sure we're all focused. Can everybody see okay?
Yes.
You see the, so I'm starting at a knit 2 and then purl 2 and then knit 2 across. So Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off requires that you process, essentially you have to do a yarn over before you do the stitch. And typically a yarn over is done from the front carrying around to the back. And what happens is you yarn over, sorry, your working needle, the new needle, and you go into the stitch and you knit it. And then you process the yarn over by passing it over the stitch. So you're creating a stitch in between each one. Now, when you're knitting, they want you to go in the opposite direction. So what a yarn over normally is, what I just showed you, is coming from behind, coming to the front, and then passing over. But in Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off, you actually reverse that for the knit stitch. So you come from behind and over the needle. And then you would knit one, and then you would process that. And now I've got 2, I would pass the first one over the second. Now I have a purl stitch. So I would create the yarn over in the normal way for the purl stitch, come all the way around, and then pull the 1 stitch over, and then you would do a bind off. So I'll do that again. The yarn over goes all the way around from front to back before you do a purl stitch. And then you pull that yarn over the purl stitch you've just worked, and then you do a cast off, the bind off. Now I'm back to knitting. So knitting, normally we would go this way around the needle. So now we want to go the other way, all the way around, and knit. You want to take that yarn over your knit stitch, and then you want to bind off the next stitch. So it creates an edge that looks a little bit beaded and loose. And it's surprisingly stretchy. So again, before a knit stitch, I come from the back to the front, I knit the next stitch, I pull the yarn over the knitted stitch, and then pull the previous stitch over the one we've just created. And now I'm back to a purl stitch. The purl stitch, I bring the yarn to the front, wrap it around the needle back to the front, purl the stitch, pull the yarn over my purl stitch, and then bind off a stitch. Or, drop a stitch, whichever. You're not wearing my best magnifying glass. There we go. So pull that stitch, then do it again. So the yarn's in front already for the purl stitch. You wrap it around the normal way back to the front, purl the stitch, and take the yarn over, and then process. I want to say process, and then bind off the last stitch. Let me make sure that that's nice. So I'm just putting that there so that you can see how stretchy that bind off is. It's got it's a little bit decorative, and there's an extra little bit in between each of the stitches. Now the problem I have with it is that this can be too stretchy. It can be, so it's kind of like if you pick up too many stitches and it becomes rippled. The effect of the bind off being so stretchy, it's essentially you're creating too many stitches by doing the yarn over in front of each one. And so it can create what looks like a ripply or frilled edge to your sock. And I find that a little bit objectionable. I don't really like the frilled edge. So the happy medium between a regular bind off and Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off would be to do the surprisingly stretchy bind off for some of the stitches and not all. And you can decide which some you like. So you could decide, I'm going to do it for all of my purl stitches, or all of my knit stitches, or, and this is my favorite, the first knit and the first purl of each rib. So I'm going to demonstrate what that would look like. And then you get to decide for yourself. So here's my last one that I did. So let's say I was going to do the Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off for just the knit stitches. So I would process my knit stitch and do it for both of the knit stitches. And then I would bind off for the purl as usual. And that would create an even number of bumpy bind offs or decorative bind offs going around. So that you could, you know, not have a weird looking sock. So that's what that looks like. So here are the two Jenny's surprisingly stretchy ones, and here are two normal ones, and here are two more. So you can see there's just a little bit more going on with the Jenny's ones, and they would alternate on your knit stitches. Or you could do that for the purl stitches, or you could do it for the first one of each set of ribs. So that would be like this, that you would do the yarn over, around, and purl. Is everybody okay with the yarn overs go one way and then the other way?
No, I can't keep it in my head.
Okay. Oops. So a normal yarn over is with the yarn already in the front and carried over the back of the needle. So you only do the normal yarn over for the purl stitches. And then the opposite yarn over is the yarn is at the back and you carry it forward around the needle. And that's what you do for the knit stitches. So normally, think about it this way too. Splitty stitch. Normally, your yarn is already at the back for a knit stitch. So if you're carrying it around from back to front, so that it goes back to the back. I think you have to make a little mnemonic.
Mnemonic, I think it's called.
Mnemonic.
Yeah.
Whatever helps you remember. So here's a regular yarn over and a purl stitch, and then a bind off, and then a regular purl stitch. So this is alternating just with the first one. So the way that it would work, so you can see a little bit of, it's still stretchy, but there's also some normal bind offs in there, so it's not quite as loose as the beginning.
I had a question about the bind offs in general.
Mm-hmm.
I never liked passing the stitch over. I always found that it looked floppy. So what I learned to do, I think I learned this from one of the designers. I think it was Lucy Needfee, just to give her credit. What about knitting it or purling them together instead of passing it over? I think it made it
That's-
a little more stretchy. What's your
So
take on
that's
that?
a good one. That's a nice alternative. That's called the Russian lace bind off.
Oh, okay. There was a name for it. Okay. I'll
Yep.
have to-
So what that would look like is, let's say we just worked a stitch, you would knit through the back loops.
Exactly.
I am catching my yarn. Okay, knit through the back loop. So now my new stitch is on the right needle. Pass it back to the left needle. The next stitch is a knit, so I would knit through the back loops.
Yeah, that's it exactly. I mean, I guess I play with it, try it with Jenny's surprisingly stretchy, and then knit it instead.
No,
of
it's a great
pulling.
suggestion. So then when you purl, you would again put this yarn back there. Do you
Exactly.
purl through the back loops then, or do you just purl normally?
I'm not sure. I think I purl normally.
You purl normally. I
I
would,
mean, whatever makes it look, finished, whatever gives it the right polish.
right. I think purling normally would probably be fine.
I also
So
purl Eastern style, so the orientation of my purl stitches is different from conventional knitting.
Well, that's no help, Miriam.
I know. I'm sorry. What I'm saying is that I purl very differently from other people, and
Okay.
it took me 20 years to learn that.
So I just want to point out the difference in the techniques that we're using. So you can see here, the first bit of my bind off was the Jenny's, and it's quite stretchy. And then I did Jenny's and I alternated, and it's a little bit less corrugated.
Let's take a look at the number 10 travel.
Whoops. I'm gonna mute everybody. And if you need to say something, please feel free to come on. Okay, so then this is what Miriam is talking about here. And you can see that it does look a lot tidier for your knitting and purling. It may be another sort of in-between step between the full-on corrugation of the Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy and how much extra material you get in your edge, and then between this and a straight bind off. So again, with this, I would probably just do a regular bind or a regular purl two together for the purl two together ones, and then I would knit two together through the back loop. Oop. But I would actually move my yarn to where it's supposed to be before I did that. So the name of this bind off is the Russian lace bind off. And it's a very nice bind off also for the edge of other things. People who do lace work on shawls and things like it as well. It has a very tidy, pretty edge. Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy one has almost a beaded appearance, especially if you're doing it in one color and not mixing colors like my sock yarn is doing right here. But that is also a nice one for ribbing or just straight knitting if you need a really extra amount. So like, let's say you have a really wide foot and you find that the bind off is always too tight. This would be a good, the Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy on every stitch would be a good choice for that. All right. Does anybody want to see it again?
For the Russian lace bind off, would you use a larger needle like you do for a normal bind off, or
Oh,
just
what
that
an
size needle?
interesting question. So here's a frustrating answer for your interesting question. In my reading of things, consulting various experts, some experts in sock knitting are very opposed to this using of a bigger needle in the bind off. And their reasoning is that it just makes it loose. It doesn't make it stretchy. There's a difference between big stitch and actually stretchy. So a bigger stitch is not as elastic as a stitch that's made to be, you know, stretchier. And I thought that was an interesting dilemma to put us all in. And thanks very much. So I'm hesitating to say just use a bigger needle these days because of that. And I haven't had a chance to really try it out. Have you been using a bigger needle to bind off usually? I'm not sure who asked that.
I haven't personally. What I do is when I bind off, even with ribbing, what I've had really good luck with is doing what you call the Russian bind off, but instead of knitting, purling it. So I have like a purled finish to the edge, and I've not used a larger needle. And I have found my sock finishes look really nice.
So instead of knitting or purling as you come to it in the pattern, you just purl it?
I just purl it and it gives it a nice edge.
Let's see what that looks like. And you're just normally purling, but your weird purl that nobody can see.
Well, I just, basically I just purl regularly.
Okay, let's try it and see what happens.
Are you finding that knit two together or purl two together really creates a stretchy edge? Because I'm not seeing mine looking so stretchy.
So this is me just purling. So I purl two together. I put the new stitch I've just made back on the left needle, and then I go back into the stitch next to it, and that's all I'm doing.
Yeah, I would
regardless.
I keep a medium. I watch my tension when I bind off as well, and if I keep a medium tension, I find I just like the finish.
Okay, so that's the appearance. So especially if you're doing it in striping yarn, you can see that it's turning the knit face of those stitches inside because the bump is on the outside. So you're seeing the purl side of it. If it were the same, my cat is playing the gravity game. If it were the same color, these would just look like an edging of stitches.
Exactly.
So Miriam, I think that's a really very inventive way to do a stretchier than normal bind. I would argue though that if you don't alternate between knitting and purling, it's not as stretchy because the corrugation of doing the ribbing does add a little bit to the stretchiness, just like it does in the knitting itself.
Yeah.
So I'd be a little bit concerned that that's not stretchy enough if you're not going to alternate it, but you could alternate the purl over the knits and the knits over the purl to give it a more decorative appearance, because it would be more noticeable if the purls were on the knit stitches and vice versa.
Yeah, I adjusted
Tina,
to the kind
sorry.
of yarn I'm using too, the kind of yarn and what the leg stitch is.
Right. So, and you were saying that you watch your tension, and that is not something that all knitters are able to do in equal measure. Tina, your question, could you repeat it? Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, no, I was muted. I was trying to see how stretchy it was doing the knitting two together, either knitting two or purling two. And it didn't seem very stretchy, but now that I've done more, I can see that it's stretching.
It's stretchy-er.
Yeah.
None of these are the same as introducing elastic to your knitting, like actual elastic, but they are stretchy-er than a typical standard bind off.
Okay.
So for a standard bind off, the only options that you have for making them looser is to make the stitches bigger with a bigger needle, and ribbing helps to create more elasticity because the movement of the yarn back and forth helps to add extra. So the next step would be the next more elastic thing would be either to do something like the Russian lace bind off, or in rib or in a single stitch across. I would suggest, if you were doing the Russian lace bind off, doing it in rib, and then to be more decorative, you could put the purl stitches over the knit stitches of your sock and vice versa. And then Jenny's surprisingly stretchy one, again, I find it a little bit too frilly sometimes
Mhm.
at the beginning. The actual demonstrated photos of it on, I'm going to share my screen. The demonstrated photos of it on, where is it? Hold, please. On the page, I just put up, make it look super frilly. So I just put up a link under Sock Club, and it's right here. And it has, so this is it in the same color yarn, and here is it done on like a baby sock in a purple. And when you scroll to the end, I just find that looks really super frilly looking. But if you need the extra stretch, it is very, very stretchy. So this is only when it's in relaxation. When you actually have a foot in it, it looks fine. So if you need the extra stretch because your foot or the foot of the person you're making your sock for is that big, then it doesn't really matter if it looks frilly when it's not worn, because that's not when you're looking at the sock. How's that? Any questions? Any
I have
other?
a question.
Yes.
Because my socks were two colors,
Yes,
when
ma'am.
I switched to my cuff color, I wanted it to look a little different. So I did a twisted rib on the knit stitches.
Oh, okay.
So when I bind off, I don't twist on the bind off, do I? I just do it straight, or do I
I
twist?
would not.
Okay.
A twist is going to increase the tension or bring in the tension.
Right.
So I would suggest using just a regular knit stitch. Did you
Okay.
like the twisted rib on the top?
I do. I have a few more rows that I still need to get done, but yeah, it just gave it a little bit, because I just found the constant rib to be a little bit mundane. And so I wanted something a little different to make the cuff just look a little bit different. So I twisted the knit stitches on the cuff.
Okay. Yeah. Doing a twist, I think maybe I said this before when we were doing the twisted rib on the Every Which Way sock, but doing a twisted rib is actually a standard practice in places where they knit things to stay warm in the wintertime and to stay warm and dry. So twisted rib on the cuff of your mittens, your socks, or the hem of your sweater, or the cuffs of your sweater, is a nice way to keep them against the body and to prevent the cold air from getting under. So it does snug up things a little bit, but that's the opposite of what you want to do on the bind off. We want to unsnug the bind off a little bit. Okay. Well, that is all of the information I had for you all today. But